Hello, sorry I'm late. All right, and so see here, let me get the names down. I apologize that the assignment is not up yet. There are just multiple variables that I've just allowed to distract me so far, but that is going to happen as soon as this meeting is over. If I have not yet, I'm also going to put test number 2 up for you to be able to peruse before long before you have to take it. I don't know about long before, actually. We're just assignment or two away from it. Um, but if you don't mind, DS, if you could, ma'am, verbally tell me or type in your name for me. There we go. Thank
Yeah,
you.
sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I just want to make sure I give you credit for being here.
Thank you.
No problem at all. All right. And so let's see here. Let me make sure that I have everyone. So we've done the Articles of Confederation, right? And we've done the classic interpretations that you'll find very often in history books when you read that topic. For one, right, that the events and the behavior of the states, of the individual states, right, and of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation played right into the hands of the conservatives, right? That the very criticism that historically they had read about having a loose confederacy, about having too democratic of a government. I know that sounds almost silly today with our assumptions and axioms that we accept today, but yes, they did believe that. They had read that, and and the events played right into their hands, right, where they could tell the liberals, who were the libertarians, who wanted small government at that time, right, and wanted to err on the side of too much democracy and not being too aristocratic. They could tell them, see, I told you so. I told you that it would not work well. So at any rate, let's see here. 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so I have the 12 of your names. So great, great, great. All right. So this assignment, which sadly I haven't even put up yet. And again, I'm going to put it up immediately when we're done. I want you to see it here because this one's a little different. Okay. It's not argumentative. There aren't any argumentative sections that you're trying to dissect and see what the thesis is, how well it's defended, etc. Right? There are a couple, 2 or 3 exceptions, and this is the first of them. So notice what I ask of you, okay? And what I'm going to do also is I'm going to give an exact number. A lot of people don't like the lack of a finite criterion, and so I'm gonna rectify that. I'm gonna tell you exactly how many examples I'm expecting, okay? But what I have is just I've copied and pasted, which you have in the back of your textbook, in Alan Brinkley's textbook, and of course you can Google very easily to get. But the original Constitution with the first 10 amendments, all right? So looking at the original Constitution and the first 10 amendments by way of the textbook or by way of the internet and Googling it, but also by way of my copy and paste job here on the handout itself. Obviously, I have it on here. Look at it, look through it, and I'd like you to make a list, 3 lists actually, right, under these 3 categories, either enlightened, conservative, or pragmatic. And I'll tell you right now, with whatever number I come up with, I'm not expecting every article to be incorporated into one of the 3. All right. I'm not expecting that much. Every single article, right? Or every single, I'm sorry, I used the wrong word. There are 3 articles, right? The first article is the legislator, Congress, because they felt symbolically that the legislator is the most important, that sovereignty or authority, permission to rule comes from the governed. And of course, the legislator was arguably the most democratic of the 3 branches. And so they put the legislator first. Then Article 2 is the executive, the president, right, and his cabinet, his or her cabinet. And then Article 3 is the judicial branch, right? The Supreme Court. And so you have 3 articles, and each of them has a clause, if you will. I'm sorry, I can't recall what the exact term that they use in the lexicon, but you don't have to refer to every clause in one of the 3 categories. Okay, it won't be even close to that. But I am going to ask that you use at least one example from each of the 3 articles, from all 3 articles, right? And put them in at least one of these 3 categories. So at any rate, enlightened, I have here, right, as with my subjective definition, any element to this Constitution that is ostensibly designed to prevent tyranny. This includes methods of checks and balances of one branch of government over another, any measure intended to ensure transparency, right, where we get to see what the governing authorities are up to and they're held accountable in one way or another to the people, right, or accountability of officials to the quote people or others, limitations to discretionary powers of rulers, so limited rule, right? Any powers vested in the most democratically elected body, in this case, it's the House of Representatives. A blatant example of this I put at the end is the Bill of Rights, ensuring citizens' basic rights and freedom. That would be an example, I believe, of an enlightened component that you can find in this Constitution. Okay. So anytime you see anything about an elect official to be elected, especially under a short term, and then by way of accountability of reelection, right? That would be an enlightened component. Well, we're going to get into some examples, okay? Very, very, very soon. Then conservative is a second category, all right, of your 3 categories that I asked you to make. Any element to this Constitution that seems to conserve early modern or medieval notions. So basically, like the word implies, right? You're conserving tradition. You're conserving the status quo. You're conserving what human history is already accustomed to and has been found, time and time again in multiple civilizations. So I put like the following: power vested in a quote better sort or an elite of some sort, right? So obviously your mind might go immediately to the Supreme Court. These are hand-picked justices for life. That arguably is a conservative facet to the Constitution, right? And trusting a handful of men and women that are handpicked for life, right? To use its own discretion without much accountability to the governed. Power centralized in a strong central government agency. They call that unitary government. You're going to find that throughout human history, right? For so many years. I think of, Sargon and some of the Mesopotamian, well, in his case, it was Assyrian, right? But under Mesopotamia, some of the first centralized rulers, right? So that is very conservative. That's very typical in human history, having a strong centralized government, right, over the near and distant regions, as opposed to deliberately weakened and decentralized, right, what the libertarians wanted, like we found in the previous assignment. Let's see here, limited democracy, ruled by the demos or the common people, right? And so any degree to which you find, right, that the number of offices of key pivotal federal offices that are elected is a minority, for instance, is a small number, that would be considered arguably conservative, right? A strong executive and military resources that can curtail or cut short individual freedoms in the name of order and stability. That's a long history, right? Kind of a broken record in human history, whereby some chief executive, albeit whether it be named an emperor, a king, queen, a president, a prime minister, has executive power to enforce the laws, and in so has very strong police and military powers, right? I would argue that that is a conservative element to a government. And so I have here an example of this is that the only one half of one branch of the 3 originally consisted of popularly elected officials, and only by those granted citizenship status. We're going to get to that, the specifics of that very soon. Okay. And then the third one, this one's a little bit more nebulous. It's harder to define and put boundaries to. And I hope I can do justice to it so that you can put enough examples under this third category. Okay. But to me, right, pragmatic is not necessarily, it's not ideological, it's not even really ethical, right? They're not worried about, so for instance, if again, if you're libertarian, you try to stay consistent that way, right? And say, okay, government, big brother needs to stay out of our business. And so whatever issue comes up, right, whatever problem comes up, you ideally want to stay ideologically consistent and say, okay, in this matter, I'm going to limit the government to being able to do this or to do that, and no more, right? Because you want to stay consistent as a libertarian, and wanting small, unobtrusive government. But when you're pragmatic, right, on one issue, you might be libertarian. And then on another issue, you might be unitarian, where you want the big federal government to have considerable power over the people, over a local region, right? In this given situation. So with pragmatic, on the ideological spectrum of, like, from the time of the French Revolution, we talk about left and right, right? Left wanting radical change from traditional medieval and early modern politics and traditions and history. And to the far right, you want to maintain as much as early modern and medieval institutions, practices, government as possible, right? And so, and of course, that's evolved from that. But that was the original kind of definition or measuring stick. So, as if you're pragmatic, you could be left in some ways on some issues and right in others, because you're not worried about being ideologically consistent. All you're worried about is what yields the best practical results, right? You're a problem solver if you're pragmatic. So, for instance, right, in some ways you might be for the government, um, you know, uh, acknowledging people's First Amendment rights, right? Their right to peacefully protest, express themselves religiously, politically, right? Artistically, individually. However, you might believe that if people overstep that First Amendment right and things become violent, destructive, then you might believe that Big Brother needs to come in and have considerable military and police powers to squash any kind of rebellion that might arise anywhere in the country, right? So with the First Amendment, you're somewhat libertarian and enlightened, but when it comes to anything that smacks of rebellion, you become very conservative, and you think that for practical reasons we need, to stave off chaos. We need to be able to have a very strong centralized army and police forces to squash anything that arises that is destructive and rebellious, right? So in that case, I feel like that's pragmatic. That you're trying to just yield practical results, and you don't care if it's right or wrong ethically necessarily. You don't care if it's left or right on the political or ideological scale. Another example to me that's pragmatic is their compromise that they made with slavery. Right? Is they decided, you know what? Several states in the South, particularly the Carolinas and even Virginia, which had the quote enlightened, give me liberty or give me death leaders, right? They paradoxically were very stubborn about keeping slavery, right? Or else they may not agree to this 1787 Constitution and leave the Confederation and have a more centralized republic. So some people believe that it was pragmatically necessary to allow for slavery, at least for now, right? And so there you're going to find a gag rule where they can't even bring up slavery for 20 years in Congress, right? They cannot even entertain the notion of ending the slave trade for the next 20 years. But the very fact that they put that gag rule in, right, at the same time, it implies that after 20 years, they can consider the end of slavery. They can consider the end to the slave trade, right? And then also they deliberately stayed hushed about the um, the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance during the Confederation made, right, stated that anywhere along the Ohio River in the Northwest, in this new territory that would later become Indiana, Illinois, um, uh, Minnesota, Wisconsin, right around the five Great Lakes, that they would not be allowed to have slavery when that territory became states, right? They stayed silent about that, but they also did not try to push, uh, you know, enhancing that prohibition against slavery to everywhere else in the West, right? So to me, that was pragmatic. They were trying to just mollify the South enough to get them to approve the Constitution, but still keep some open doors for the future, for future generations to deal with that evil, to deal with that institution and practice, right? So that's just me, but to me, that smacks me as pragmatic. They were practically trying to kind of compromise on the slavery issue and not adhere to ideology or even ethics necessarily, right? So let's get into some examples if you don't mind. So now what I want to do is I want to, let's see here, new share. I want to do my PowerPoint here to hit some examples. But before I do, are there any questions so far or comments?
So what exactly are you trying? Do you want us to exactly write? Like, what are you kind of looking for?
Okay, so what I'm going to do, okay, Jaden, is I'm going to, like I said, what I think I'm going to do is I think put, I'm going to make 3 lists on the document itself, and I'm going to give you at least one example from all 3 on that document itself that I'm about to post. Okay, so but what I want you to do is, let's say, let me do let me see if I could do a new blank sheet. All right. And I'm going to, let's see here, boldface, underline, enlightened, right, conservative, and pragmatic. So I'm going to make 3 lists. Okay. See here. Get rid of that notion. Okay. So let's go back to this PowerPoint, and I'm going to come back to this. So for instance, the preamble, right, says, we the people do ordain and establish this Constitution. That also states later in the Constitution that under Article 4, I believe, that the Constitution is the law of the land. So to me, right in the preamble in Article 4, those are enlightened components to the Constitution, that it states, right, that sovereignty or permission to rule or the source of authority for this new government are, quote, we the people, right? So popular sovereignty. Remember, we talked about that, the social contract with John Locke and Rousseau. Okay. So we're announcing popular sovereignty. We the people do ordain and establish this Constitution, and that this written Constitution is the law of the land versus any man or woman, any president, any congressional leader, right? That the rule of law, that's another enlightened component from liberalism and from the French Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment. So so there you see, right, a couple enlightened components to the Constitution immediately. But then it says, in order to form a more perfect union, in order to establish justice, domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, provide for the general welfare. To me, those are all conservative aims. They're saying, right, the Confederation was too democratic. It was too decentralized. Now we need a stronger central government that could put down rebellions like Shays' rebellion, that could form a better, tighter union between the 13 states, right? To me, those are conservative aims. Notice they're not saying, right, that we're trying to optimize the freedom of the average American. We're trying to protect the natural rights of our citizens. They're not mentioning that, right? Their aims in the preamble are pretty conservative. What you see throughout human history, right? Kings, queens, emperors, right? Strong central governments saying we want law and order. We want, you know, uh, the absence of chaos. We want unity between the different, regions of our kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, those are all conservative aims. They're very kind of old school and traditional aims that you find throughout human history. Nothing really special, novel, or new about them. So that's just the preamble. Let's go to Article 1 about Congress. Okay. So notice what I have here, Jaden, is enlightened. And I put the section, I'm sorry, that's the term they use. Sections 1 through 3 in Article 1. The law requires the majority by this two-branch legislator to pass laws. So these elected reps in the House of Representatives and the state legislator chosen senators, a majority of them have to agree on something in both houses for it to become a law. I put argumentatively that that's an enlightened component. That it's remember, it's like the Republic of Rome. The tribunes in Rome were popularly elected by citizens, and the senators were handpicked, right, because of their background and family names, etc. And they were appointed. And so, remember Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws book of the Enlightenment, he said that there ought to be checks and balances and, a mixed government, if you will. That's what Aristotle had written about also, right? That too much democracy can lead to chaos, but an aristocracy of just unelected, wealthy, educated men can lead to an oligarchy, right? Where they just they don't. I got a new name here. Put it down here, Darren Smith. Where that they could become tyrants. This small group of unelected people, and so hence you want a mixture of those two. You want a democratically elected House, right? And then you want democratically elected state legislators appoint the senators according to Article 1. So that's one step removed from direct election by the people, right? And so hence there's a sense of balance. And yeah, so you could argue and say that that is an enlightened component. Okay. Yes, Caitlin.
Thank you. So I'm a little bit confused. So will we just read the articles and the old constitution or before it was revised and then choose stuff for under those categories?
That's
So,
right.
okay.
That's right. You're making a list, right? A handful of things, and I'm not going to be too stringent. I may even ask for only about 4 or 5 examples in each of the three categories. Okay, but but yes, you're going to make these three categories, and you're going to put whatever you think applies under each of those three categories from the three articles.
So then are there right and wrong answers?
That's a great
Or
question. That's a great question. Is what I want you to do is briefly, I mean, literally in one sentence, that's fine with me. In one sentence, I want you to defend why you think that section is enlightened or conservative or pragmatic. Okay.
okay, and then can you please go over what enlightened means one more time?
Sure. So enlightened, right? Enlightened is something that comes from remember like Bernard Balin's book that we had a bona fide revolution and that these new ideas from the Enlightenment in France and the Enlightenment in Scotland and these new ideas of the 1700s influenced us. And so the new ideas entailed like because remember with the Enlightenment, the very term, right? is that we're no longer living in the old, we're not just closing our eyes and following tradition anymore and allowing these unelected kings and queens and out of touch parliament members to just simply rule us however they please, right? Arbitrarily. But instead, we believe that there are natural laws to things, right? That God created, and that we want to be in line with those natural laws. And that we believe, right, as enlightened people after the 1740s, that people are inherently born free, in a state of freedom, and that people are inherently born with certain natural rights that they are entitled to, just from the fact that they were born as human beings, so that they should give permission to their government to rule. Their government is their servant and not their master. Their government is to be held accountable to them, right? That no single house or branch or individual in any of the three branches of the federal government should have the opportunity, much less the right, to become a tyrant over the rest of the country. That everyone needs to be held in check, his or her power, and held accountable to the people, right? That there needs to be balance in government. Once again, with the aim or end that there not be any single faction, group, political office that becomes a tyrant over everybody else. Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. So it's anything, right, that we brag about in court history that is like new or novel to human history in the 1780s, that we're going to have an enlightened nation, one with natural rights, one in which the leaders are going to be held accountable, one in which no one could become a tyrant, even if he or she wanted to become so, etc. Okay. So no, by all means, I want you to ask me questions, stop me at any time, because until you ask me that question, I don't think I'd made it clear enough. So I think that benefits everyone.
Thank you.
No problem. So look at section 2. House reps are elected every 2 years. So to me, that's definitely enlightened, right? They're held accountable. They have short terms, and then they have to run for re-election. So theoretically, at least, they are definitely accountable to their voters, right? They must be the inhabitant of the state. So meaning they can't be out of touch with the people that they're representing, right? They need to live amongst them. And we talked about that with the libertarians, right? Is that they know what it's like to live in that state, in that congressional district. They know what the problems are because, again, they reside there, right? And then not to mention that their voters could, halfway, metaphorically, halfway literally, tell them, I know where you live. If you don't rule well, we'll hold you accountable. We know where your house is within our jurisdiction. Okay. And then also the House reps have the power to impeach or formally accuse, right, a member of the Supreme Court or the president, right, of a high crime or misdemeanor, and have that person possibly removed. So those are powers and accountability that the House reps have that I thought were entitled to be considered enlightened under Section 2. All right. And then Section 3, senators, again, must be inhabitants of their states. So they must know what it's like to live there, held accountable because the people know where they live, right? And they have the power to try impeachments. So when the president, Supreme Court justice, etc., is formally accused or impeached, they decide if they're going to convict and oust or remove that individual, right? And so, the whole idea of checks and balances over someone else. So I felt like those were enlightened components. Section 4, the kings and queens, for the longest time, had to give permission to their legislators to meet. So sometimes they would go years without meeting. What good is it to have representatives to represent you and to pass laws that are needed if they don't meet, right? So Section 4 says Congress must assemble at least once a year. So I felt like that was enlightened. And then Section 5, under Article 1, the Congress must keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time, it says, have them published in the newspapers. So to me, right, that's transparency, that we get to see what our elected reps in the House are voting yay and nay on, what some of their speeches entail, right, where they stand on certain issues. So then theoretically, you could read, right, where they stand on given issues and say, wait a minute, I elected you, I helped elect you as my representative, as my voice in Congress. And I feel like I'm in the majority on this issue, that most of us, believe such and such about this issue, and you're going the opposite direction. And so hence you could theoretically hold that House rep accountable, right? If for no other ways, in 2 years, he or she has to run for reelection, and you just elect someone else instead. All right. And then Section 6 and 7, if you're a House rep or senator, you can't simultaneously serve in another office, like an executive under the cabinet of the president or anything like that.
I don't know that one.
That's a given, right? But under the English government that we had just broken from 11 years before, or not even that, actually, we didn't formally weren't accepted as independent until 1783. So only 4 years before, under the British, that was not the case. And so, as you might guess, right, if you're in Parliament, but you're also under the King's cabinet, you have a chance of being manipulative, especially when you have a conflict of interest, right? When you could do things to enrich your own pockets and to help yourself. So we kept that from happening. And not to mention, I believe it's under Article 4, but we made it very clear there will be no titles of nobility under the US like there were in England. Because remember, you had all those different titles, right? A count, a viscount, a duke, an earl, a baron, and you're automatically entitled to certain offices, certain lands and opportunities under England. And we said no way to any of that, right? There'll be no favoritism. So that's another, arguably enlightened component to our Constitution. All right. And then not to mention, right, with checks and balances, the president can veto what the majority in both houses of the legislature or Congress pass, but with a 2/3 vote, they can override his or her veto. So that arguably is enlightened also, so that the will of the people can prevail no matter what the president wants or doesn't want. Okay, any questions? So then Article 1, conservative, right? It actually says free persons in the Constitution. So that is opposed to, right, Indians and the Indian nation, they call it in the Constitution, right? Or the native nations. So the Native Americans are separated from this republic from the get-go, right? Also, indentured servants that has not been, disqualified from this new government, and they're not to be entitled to citizenship. And then 3/5 of all other persons, the whole 3/5 clause, right, as you're familiar with probably, is referring to the slaves. Notice they didn't have the guts to actually put in the word slaves. They put in euphemisms or other words, right, to substitute the word slave. But we all know it was very clear that they were referring to slaves, African slaves. So clearly, right, the Enlightenment stressed you are entitled to basic rights, opportunities, right, from being born as a human being. Well, Native Americans, indentured servants, women, African Americans are as human as anybody else, but they are not included as citizens. So that, to me, that is a very conservative element to the Constitution, is that they did not provide for and declare universal citizenship for all human beings. So what we're accustomed to now, right? If anyone is born here, if anyone comes as an immigrant and is naturalized in any of the 50 states, that person automatically is a citizen. That won't happen, you guys, until 1868, after the Civil War. So that's a long time in coming. And then note, right, the number of reps in the House is not to exceed more than one rep elected for every 30,000 civilians. So one voice for only 30,000 civilians, not even every 30,000 people, because again, those demographics we just talked about are excluded. They're disenfranchised. And so to me, that's very conservative, right? That's kind of old school. That's not that impressive. That's not that democratic as far as representative democracy, having just one voice for every 30,000 civilians. And then, of course, right, because they did not declare universal citizenship, they let each state decide for itself who could or could not be a citizen. So in the South, you're going to have anti-miscegenation laws, right? Anti, sexual contact, sexual relations, marriage between Black and white people. And literally some of them are going to implement, some of them are scary, using the 1/8 ratio. If you have one grandparent that's Black, right? Some of it will smack of later Nazi German qualifications for their people's community during their Holocaust. But some of them are actually going to implement, quote, one drop rule, so that they could prove, quote, one drop of African blood in you, you are considered Black under the law, and you are not given the opportunity for citizenship. Eventually, during the antebellum period, 5 northern states will give some citizenship rights to some African American men. And when I say some, right, part of that's entitled, which was very conservative because this comes under English common law and other societies in human history, is they had property qualifications. You had to own so much property and pay taxes to be considered eligible to be a citizen. And what Hamilton and other conservatives called it, right, was the stake in society clause, is that they felt like if you didn't own your own property, you had no stake, you had nothing to lose, and hence you didn't have good reason to be loyal to the republic. Okay, so to me, that's very conservative, the whole idea of citizenship and who was allowed citizenship and who wasn't, right? Then again, Section 3, senators are not directly elected. Not yet. Not until the 19 teens during the Progressive Era in your latter half, your 102 history class, will senators become directly elected. All right. So speaking of which, right, you have House reps as 1. You have senators as 2, a second facet or arm to the government, right? Then you have the president as 3 and vice president. Then arguably you have his or her cabinet as a separate entity or force, right? So now you're talking about 4. Then you have Supreme Court justices as 5. Of those 5 branches, if you will, segments, arms of the government, how many of those 5 are elected by citizens? 1, only the House reps. Senators were not. The president was by electoral college and not by popular vote, which is still the case, right? And vice president. Cabinet members are handpicked by the president, as are the Supreme Court justices. So that's not very democratic, right? 1 out of 5. And remember that 1, the House reps, are not even, universally elected. They're elected only by whom the states decide can be citizens. So by today's standards, right, there are many conservative elements to the Constitution. Let's see here. Section 5. Remember, it stated that from time to time there is to be a printed, log, if you will, of who's voting for what and who is saying what in the congressional meetings. It says here, except in times in their judgment require secrecy. So, to some people that totally invalidates that transparency clause, saying that they have to let us know where they're standing, what they're talking about in Congress, except when they claim that the issue requires secrecy. That's a big exception, right? So to me, that's conservative. That's old school. Then, right, Article 1, Section 8. If you look at Article 1, Section 8, during the Confederacy, the states could do many and most of these things. Because remember, it was deliberately decided that the federal government was going to be weak, right? Well, arguably not anymore. When you look at Article 1, Section 8, just going down this list, to now Congress has power to lay and collect taxes in all the states, to borrow money for credit of the U.S. government, to regulate trade with foreign countries, between the several states, and with the Native American tribes, to declare laws on bankruptcy, on naturalization, also on patents, to coin money and issue our system of standards of weights and measures, which of course we didn't embrace the metric system, to punish counterfeiting, to have a post office system, to promote, well, that's patents. Let's see here. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. So all the appellate and district and other inferior court underneath the Supreme Court, right? Systems were to be originally devised by Congress. To define and punish piracies and felonies on the high seas, to declare war, to raise an army, to put down rebellions, to develop a navy, to call forth the state militias and say, now you belong to the federal government in case of an insurrection or war, to exercise jurisdiction over Washington, D.C. as a special entity. And then look there at the bottom, to make laws which are necessary and proper in carrying out anything else that's on this list. So to some people, that necessary and proper clause is like a blank check, right? Saying, hey, we don't know what the future holds as far as technological changes, as far as demands that future generations are going to face. So we're putting in this somewhat blank check saying, even if it's not on this list, Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to do any of these things on this list. Okay? So remember, that's conservative because that's like a unitary government. That's like a central government that is all powerful over the states, over the regions, over the local areas. Okay? And then again, a 20-year gag rule in the acceptance of slavery, you could either put that as conservative or put it as enlightened. So as Caitlin had asked me, right? In some cases, you may put, it often happens actually, a student will put something as conservative when I think it's pragmatic, or pragmatic when I think it's conservative. And just at putting in a single sentence why you think it is pragmatic or conservative. I learned from you guys without false modesty. I'll literally tell myself, like, wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. That's an interesting point. So yes, and it's, I guess I'm kind of in the middle. Is, to me, some things like, House reps elected every 2 years have the power to impeach the president. You put that as conservative. To me, that doesn't make sense. That's not really, traditional as far as, history goes. I definitely want to know in your one sentence, how in the world do you find that to be conservative? So to some cases, right, some answers don't make sense unless you really convince me with your rationale. But with that having been said, there is a lot of wiggle room for personal opinion on these, so that there is not a sense to me of definitive yes and no, right and wrong answers either. You know what I mean? So I hope I'm being clear on that. I'm kind of in the middle there, where some things I think are going to be difficult for you to defend, putting them in a certain category historically, but yet quite a few things I think there's a lot of wiggle room for you to put them in at least one of at least two categories, if not all three. Okay. And then Article 1, pragmatic. Are these necessary tasks? Should practically the federal government be equipped, Congress be equipped to take the state militias, put them under federal supervision, and force them to suppress revolts or insurrections, especially if there's an invasion, right, from a foreign country? Is it pragmatically necessary that the federal government be able to borrow money on behalf of credit of the country, right? Is it practically necessary to regulate interstate trade, to deal with bankruptcies and patents and have a post office system? So all those, right, perhaps arguably could be determined as pragmatic. Then let me try to go a little more quickly here. The president, he or she gives an oath to be loyal to the Constitution. To me, that's enlightened. The president cannot rule arbitrarily, however he or she feels like or desires, but he or she is ostensibly accountable to this written Constitution, right? So to me, that's enlightened. And then the fact that Congress passes the laws, makes the laws, but he or she enforces them. Again, going to Montesquieu in his book on checks and balances, perhaps that could be considered enlightened, that he or she gets to approve and execute the laws. But you might disagree and say, I think that's conservative. Kings and queens have been doing that for years, right? Where their parliaments would make laws and they would get to approve or disapprove of them and have the police powers to enforce them. So by all means, you could disagree and think that that is conservative, that latter part of it, right? The fact that he or she is a civilian and leads the armed forces, the whole idea of checks and balances, and the libertarians saying we should never have a military dictator, right? Some people would say is enlightened, having civilian rule over the armed forces, right, to prevent a military dictatorship. And then, right, let's see here, he or she gets to make appointments of people in his or her cabinet in the Supreme Court, but the Senate has to approve of those appointments. So to me, that was enlightened. Again, checks and balances, right? Then you have State of the Union address in the Constitution. The president needs to, from time to time, go to Congress and, in the spirit of checks and balances, right, and sharing power, has to, one, become transparent with Congress, tell Congress what he or she is up to, right, as far as concerns, present tasks, present dilemmas and issues that he or she is tackling. In the spirit of communication and transparency, let Congress know, but also, right, tell Congress what he or she believes is in the form of advice and counsel, not directives, not telling them what to do, right? That would not be in the spirit of checks and balances, but telling them, right, what he or she believes as an outsider of Congress that they ought to address as an issue, etc. And so then also, right, the president is impeachable, can be accused and removed from office. So I put those as enlightened components to Article 2. Now we're no longer dealing with Congress, but with the president and vice president and cabinet. Conservative, however, the president is not democratically elected to this day, not by majority of citizens, right, but by way of the electoral college system. And each state, right, has the electoral points that is congruent with how many congressmen there are. And you have one Congress, one House rep for every 30,000 civilians, and 2 senators no matter what, right? The president to this day has to be a natural born citizen, right? So any immigrant who has lived for, decades and decades and has been long naturalized, still cannot constitutionally run for president. So that's kind of old school. I thought that was considered conservative. Patronage power. Kings and queens had appointing power, right? And the president's no different. He or she appoints, the Secretary of the Treasury to run things economic, the Attorney General over the law system, right? And legal system and lawyers and courts, etc. Secretary of State to represent the country diplomatically with other countries, right? These ambassadors were the same as England. That was an old English and long before English political tradition for kings and queens and executives to do. Pardon power, right? To pardon criminals. Can convene Congress, even though the president cannot keep Congress from uniting and going in session, right? He or she can demand that they come into session, can call them into session. And I think of your 102 class, Franklin Roosevelt, during the Great Depression and his New Deal, he forced Congress to convene on more than one occasion. To me, that's conservative. That's old school, like an old king or queen demanding things of the legislator, right? And then, of course, veto power. You could consider that enlightened in the system of checks and balances, or you could say, dude, kings and queens had veto power over their parliaments for centuries before this new constitution. There's nothing new to that. That to me is considered conservative, maybe, right? And then Article 2 with the president, treaty making power, patronage power to have a cabinet to do day-to-day things. Some people would say, well, I don't really consider that conservative, even though that had been done for centuries. I don't really consider it enlightened in the system of, checks and balances and the executive having these powers as opposed to the legislator. But I just consider it practically necessary, right? Things have to get done. You have to have a bureaucracy to engage in all the tasks that are necessary from day to day throughout the year. And so that to some people is just a very practical clause that makes pragmatic sense. And then if you'll indulge me one more here, miscellaneous. Article 6, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. To me, right, that's enlightened. So the ultimate authority is either we, the people, who gave our permission for the Constitution, and or the Constitution itself. And remember, to me, that's enlightened because the Enlightenment and liberals of that time period of the 1700s wrote that they didn't want arbitrary power. They didn't want rule by individuals who could rule by their own mood, their own whim, their own desires, right? But that they will be held accountable by a written document, because the written document will play no favorites. It should have enlightened components written inside it. And it is consistent. It won't change. It's written down. It stays the same. Conservative. Supreme Court justices are appointed for good behavior. And of course, that's a euphemism. That's another way of saying for life, basically. Conservative. There is a fugitive slave law in the Constitution that states, right, that runaway slaves that run away from Virginia, South Carolina, or Maryland and make it to New Jersey, New Jersey has to extradite them, has to allow them to be brought back to their masters back in Carolinas. Okay. Then also, there's a property clause that says all debts, all property accounts that existed prior to this Constitution of 1787 are to be respected, right, and adhered to after this Constitution. So of course, right? To me, that's very conservative. What, son? I might need to check on my son for a minute. I'm so sorry. I know that's so informal, but I'm here alone with a homeschooled 7-year-old son. But at any rate, all debts and property, right? In whose interest, theoretically, does that adhere to? The rich. Those who have money owed to them want it paid back. Those who own a slave want that slave to be recognized as their property, right? So to me, that's a very conservative clause, that all debts and property ownership are to be respected, right? After the Constitution as opposed to before. And then Article 5, to me, the amendment process is pragmatic, right? To me, subjectively, is that if the power that, the founding fathers stated, we have no idea the problems and issues that future generations are going to face. So let's give them a clause and a process by which they can make new amendments in the future to adapt to those demands, to those changes, right? To those future conditions. So to me, that's very practical. That's pragmatic. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights, I would contend, is enlightened, right? These are stating, right, specifically human rights, although not necessarily human, right? Because remember, only citizens, only those whom states decide are citizens are entitled to those rights. Okay. But let's see here. Let me go to those, if you will. Sorry. Trying to find it here. There we go. Let's see here.
I don't know if you
Yes.
saw it, but I think Rudy made a chat to everyone.
Oh, no, I did not. I apologize. Let me see if I could find that. Or breakout room. Let me stop share. See if I could find, okay, chat. Yes, Rudeep, that's okay. That's okay, especially as we're almost finished. That's perfectly fine. Thank you for asking. Okay. So if you'll indulge me here, let me trying to share again. Sorry. I'm going to share the screen, okay? And I'm going to go back to the blank sheet of paper that I had to make sure we're on the same page, okay? Will you please give me just one moment to check on my son? I'm sorry, it's so informal, but I need to check. So sorry about that. Okay, so enlightened, right? So let's go ahead and let's give an example, okay? Article 1, right? And you don't even have to do it section by section. I'm gonna be lazier here, okay? Because really, for the sake of I don't want to try your patience with going back and forth and checking the exact section, etc. Right? But I'm going to give multiple examples from Article 1. Okay, I'm going to say House reps are directly elected by the citizens, right? And they must run for election every 2 years. To me, that's an enlightened component. Okay. then in addition to that, I would say that Congress is comprised of an elected house and an unelected house, in the spirit of checks and balances, right? Because remember, Montesquieu had written, you don't want too much democracy, nor do you want just an oligarchy of unelected people, but you want a balance thereof. Okay. Congress must, from time to time, post a record of the proceedings and votes, right? Illustrating transparency with or to their constituents, right? Congress has the power, in the spirit of checks and balances, to impeach and remove the president or Supreme Court justices. All right. And then bouncing down to conservative. Only one branch, or one, I don't know if I was call it a branch, because technically there are only 3 branches, but only one arm, if you will, of the government, the House Reps, of 5, because you're counting the president and cabinet, Supreme Court, right? The senators. Only one arm of the government of 5 is elected directly by citizens, as that is not very democratic, right? Also conservative, right? The arguably Article 1, Section 8 gives considerable powers to Congress, thus taking considerable powers from the states, right? Contrasted with the Confederation that we had before, right? So that's conservative, making a much stronger central government. And then not to mention, right, citizenship. Is not universally declared.
So would we just choose one of those sentences, or would we write like all 3?
I would ask you to please write all 3. I'm going to give you a definitive number, but I'm going to probably ask for at least about 4 examples under each category.
So we would write like 4 examples of sections from the Articles of Confederation or something, and then we would give several sentences as like to back up our answer.
That's right. Yes. So you will write at least 4 sections as enlightened, at least 4 sections as conservative, at least 4 sections as pragmatic, and just briefly tell me why you have it under that particular category.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, like Congress members right now, how they can run like they after they do want serve one term, they can run again and again and again. Would that
Yes,
be considered conservative?
absolutely. Absolutely. And right, that is a that's a great example that you're using, Jaden, because that's an example of omission, right? You're not going to find a clause in there that explicitly states congressmen can run an unlimited number of terms, but nothing is in there that limits their number of terms. So you're absolutely right. That would be an example, right, of arguably conservative, right, um, in the form of an omission, that nothing is stated in there to limit their number of terms. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So
I have a-
remember again, enlightened, you have also the Bill of Rights, anything to do, examples um, of checks and balances, right? Conservative, don't forget about slavery, right? But again, pragmatic. Again, anything under Article 1, and this is argumentative. Uh, Article 1, Section 8 examples, right? I put a question mark there because that's argumentative. To some people, when they read through that list of what Congress can now do outside of the Confederation, some people find that to be very practical and not conservative, right? Conservative in the sense that you're empowering the central government, but pragmatic in the sense that, yeah, there will be likely rebellions, insurrections, foreign invasions, and there does need to be a practical, solution or option that's available to Congress in the event of that happening. All right. Again, some people would say instead of conservative, that some of the clauses they see about slavery were merely pragmatic. They were not moral, they were not ideologically inclined, but they just were practically yielding to the demands of the Southern states. That pretty much explicitly stated they would not join this new union if they didn't have their rights to their quote property insured, right? Um, Shoot, I'm drawing a blank. I was just about to put another example of pragmatic, and now it's eluding me. But does that help you guys? Do you guys feel generally okay about what I'm asking? I do understand and recognize, and I'm going to try to make up for it, that this is much more nebulous than my other assignments. I feel like I'm pretty clear on what I want on the argumentative assignments, and this is a little less clear. And I'm going to try to make up for that and put more explicit examples of things in the handout itself that I'm about to post today for this week.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are we gonna say it in like the paragraph essay form that we usually do, or are we gonna put it in this like outline form?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't mind if you put it in paragraph form. I think you'll find with me that I'm a messy instructor. I am not anal retentive on format, etc. I myself, most of the time, have found that my students have put this in the form of a mere list, and I've kind of almost come to accept that. But if you wanted to put it in format and in paragraph form, I'm perfectly fine with that as well. Yeah, I don't sweat the small stuff.
And I also have another question. Why does when we like make another submissions like for the exam, it pulls a little bit of our grade down, like 1 or like 0.5%?
Gosh. Well, with the first test, right? I mean, I would imagine it's supposed to incorporate what your score is and then average it out with everything else that you have submitted and everything else that I've graded. That's another thing, right? Is I'm behind in grading. Uh, but it's all supposed to be averaged out by the system itself in Canvas. Um, so I would recommend if you're not satisfied with the score and with the average after your test, take advantage of that multiple submission clause format that I put in, and try to get a higher score and see if it should average a higher conclusion.
Okay. And also, about like the assignments, we also have, are they gonna be like, sorry for if I'm asking, like, but like, are they going to be like graded anytime soon?
Yes, and I apologize for that.
Okay,
I'm
thank.
definitely running behind, and I'm very soon to play catch up. Okay, I'm sorry about that. But yeah, they will be graded, and the system should grade them themselves. And please remember that in any cases where I originally go over them and you don't have anything, I have to put a zero. Okay, for various reasons. I'm just learning this because sometimes I like to skip them and give you more time to do it for partial credit. But for various reasons, I have to put a zero. And so if any of you do makeup work after I've graded it, I need you to explicitly remind me to notify me via Canvas message so I know to go back to Southern Colonies or whatever it is and find your exact name and find your late submission and resubmit a partial credit grade. Okay.
Okay.
I've got a question. Your PowerPoint, will you be posting that?
Oh, I'd be happy to.
Oh, that'd be great. Okay,
Yeah, I'd be
thank you.
happy to. I'm glad you asked because I wouldn't have originally thought of doing that. But I will make note of that and I'll be happy to post that PowerPoint.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so I appreciate your patience. Okay. But like I said, please remember, I don't sweat the small stuff. So don't worry about the format in which you do it. But please notice, right? When you give your at least perhaps, 4 examples under each category, make sure that when I look under all 3 categories, I could find in any of the 3, you don't need them in all 3. Okay. But in it throughout any of the 3 that I find an example under all 3 of the first 3 articles, right? Something stated about the legislator or Congress, something in any of the 3 about the executive, president, and cabinet, and something in any of the 3 about the Supreme Court. Okay. And I'll try to make that clear on the document itself. All right. So yeah, thank you guys. Like I said, this is an anomaly. We're gonna get right back to very soon. We're gonna get right back to the same format of argumentative sections. I just have a couple exceptions, and this is one of them. And I'm still trying to work out the kinks as far as what I am and am not sufficiently clear about as far as my expectations. All right. So thank you for your patience regarding everything. Some of the videos I'm finding have not been able to be opened by some students. I'm working on the technological facet of that. I'm noting all of this. I'm definitely behind in my grading, and I don't think I posted test 2 yet, which I want you to be able to look at ahead of time. And again, like I said, there are kinks I'm still working out with this particular assignment. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I have credit. I have all 12 of your names. You'll get extra credit for this. I appreciate that. Be looking for this to be posted very soon. And you guys, if you have any questions, as always, Canvas message me, okay? So thank you. Thank you for showing up. It's good to see you from week to week. and I'll go ahead and call it a day in a week. Okay.
Omar had a question, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Please.
Omar had a question in the chat. He said that if you have a date for the next test. So Omar had a question.
Sure. Let's see here. Okay, so for the next test, again, let me go back. Sorry, I keep going back and forth here. Where did I find that originally? What I wanted to do, put this up initially, so then I can go to my my syllabus, right? So we are MJC. Where are you? Right here, 101 syllabus. So despite the chaos of this year with my COVID and everything, the schedule should be the same. I don't believe that we've messed up anything as far as the schedule of things. So notice, right, we're doing the Constitution, right, this week, Monday, March 1st through the 8th. Next week, the 8th through the 15th, we will do a great man history of the early republic, namely the history of the first 3 presidents. Then the week after that, the 15th through the 21st, we will have the War of 1812. That is your second, and I think the only other anomaly, where it's going to be a series of video questions instead of an argumentative assignment. And then finally, test 2. So we have 2 more after this week. We have 2 more weeks, 2 more topics that we have to cover. The first 3 presidents, all combined into one assignment, and then the War of 1812, and then the third week, test 2. So it'll be the week of March 22nd through the 28th. All right, that's when you will have test 2. And again, I will be happy to I'm going to post the second test very soon, so you have plenty of time ahead of time to see what will be thrown at you. Okay, so any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have one question. This Word document right here, are you going to like post this as like a little bit of like an example or an idea, or
Yeah, the one that I just that I was
the one
just kind of improvising and writing on.
yeah, like the one you're screen sharing right now?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I think you already posted test number 2. It's 35 questions.
Okay, good. Maybe I have.
Yeah, I
Oh,
printed
perfect.
it off. You did.
Okay, thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
Good, good, good. All right. That's great. So yeah, absolutely. Take advantage of that. That is precisely the test that you'll be taking in a few weeks. So you'll know exactly what's thrown at you. All right. Okay, anything else? All right. All right. And so I'm going to go ahead and call it a day, okay? But thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for
Thank
hanging
you.
in there with me. I hope this was instructive and helps you as far as, any ambiguity that I have regarding my expectations on this, let's face it, kind of a unique assignment. And just remember at the end of the day, effort pays with me. So when I see 3 categories, I see a decent amount of examples and rationale given, you're going to get 50 out of 50. All right, so don't sweat it too much. Just employ some effort and some thought, and I'm sure you'll be fine. Okay, so thank you. I'm going to go ahead and call it a meeting. Okay, have a good day, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
very-
Bye.
Bye.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you to all of you.